Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being. Welcome to the 106th episode of the award-winning Diverse Minds podcast. September's focus is all about enhancing your workplace through cross-cultural understanding. And to kick this month off, I've got a great guest, Dr Nathalie van Meurs. Dr Nathalie van Meurs has a PhD from the University of Sussex. She's an academic with a background in cross-cultural psychology. She's a senior lecturer, researcher, and an author of fiction in her spare time. She's also one of the co-founders, directors, and secretary of the Dutch Academic Network in the UK, set up in collaboration with the Dutch Embassy after Brexit to foster the bilateral relationships with the Netherlands and Britain, in order to help Dutch academics and researchers manage the other new normal. Her teaching and research is focused on values, justice, and cultural intelligence. Recently, she published on a 17-nation study about how formalization can help employees collaborate. She's also voiced ideas in uncertain times and another on the role of cultural psychology in journalism. She set up her own website, Identity Research, and a podcast, Polaris, that is about making academic research related to navigating this complex, globalized world more accessible. Recently, she was on a panel of experts for the International Coaching Federation on how to incorporate diversity and sustainability into their coaching work. And she set up a group on LinkedIn entitled Mindfulness, Meditation and Psychology that has over 1,000 followers. So needless to say, we're delighted to be kicking the month off with Dr. Nathalie van Meurs. Nathalie, a huge welcome to the show.
Hi, Layla. First, I wanted to thank you for inviting me. We've known each other for so long. When was it? 2005? And when you approached me for this podcast, I got very excited. But I also took some time to really think things through because you have some really interesting topics that you discuss.
Oh, thank you. We're just overjoyed to have you here. So I will just have read out your intro, which gives a little flavour about you, Nathalie, and what you do. But I think it'd be really great for the listeners to hear more about yourself, what you do and why you do what you do.
Yeah, so I'm an academic and my background is in cross-cultural psychology. I'm a lecturer, researcher, and I actually also am an author of fiction in my spare time. I'm also the director of the Dutch Academic Network in the UK, set up after Brexit with support of the Dutch Embassy, basically to foster the bilateral relationships with the Netherlands and Britain, and to help Dutch academics like myself to manage the other new normal, which is a bit tricky. And we've received some difficult dilemmas like lack of clarity about PhD funding, issues with recognition about qualifications, cells for important immunology research held at the border and they thawed and they died, which is immeasurable in terms of finance, let alone the impact of our health. So I really care about that. And so my research and teaching is about cultural values, justice, and cultural intelligence.
Amazing. And I just think you talking about the cells that perished at the border, it is heartbreaking because that's so much work. It's collaboration. It's not just a case of you can start things again. And that's one example. And we know there's so many examples like that. So this work is really, really important. So Nathalie, what made you then decide that you wanted to really niche down and become an expert in this area of cross-cultural psychology?
So just to kind of start with the present, so some of the things that my PhD students look at are, for instance, organizational fairness in Chad, female academics' career progression in Bangladesh, or business analytics and organizational culture in a Turkish bank. So it really varies. And my background is that when I was a teenager, my Dutch father took me on a business trip with him. And so these are not holidays. They are events with business professionals. And when I was 16, he took me to China just before the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989. And it blew me over. Not just because China is so different. Obviously, this is the case for me, that teenager. But more, it was that I recognized that all these people were working in the civil engineering business. They were also all men. And they were meeting and discussing work in a shared field of expertise, but it was the cultural differences that had an influence on the dynamics. And so to my father, it was business is business. But to me, it planted a different kind of seed. And very quickly, I learned that there is no such thing as othering because I'm not the norm. And then after graduating from Sussex University in applied psychology, I moved to America. And then again, I was blown away by cultural differences. But in Atlanta, Georgia, it was about race. And there's this highway, the I-20, that literally cuts the city into two. And the Black community lives in the south, whereas the north was white. And yet, despite the fact that Georgia is part of the Bible Belt, Atlanta is actually very gay friendly. Now, it would take a lot more research, so I don't know the specifics about this, but it seems that it was open-minded about one social identity, not so much about the other. And in America, unlike in the UK, I was also more confronted with my Dutch identity. So, if we would find each other in the supermarket, and if you would hear somebody speak Dutch, you would just walk up to them and talk to them. And suddenly I started celebrating cultural events that I really never paid any attention to in my native, the Netherlands, but also not in the UK. Why is that? Was the UK culturally close enough? There's such a concept, obviously, like geographical distance, but there's also cultural distance. And I found that really interesting. So then I started to do my PhD in cross-cultural psychology.
It's so interesting you say that, because I can identify with that. When I went to do a voluntary support program in Barcelona in Spain, and I spoke Spanish, but I didn't speak, and I still don't speak Catalan. And when I went there, I never saw myself as British, really. And then when I went there, oh my goodness, I never felt so British. So things like you're saying, you focus in on certain things, like people don't queue, and that really irritated me. The way in which people were really evasive. So there's a lot about British culture around, you don't get invited to people's homes. People don't really say what they mean. Well, I found it even more so in Barcelona. People would say, come to my house for dinner, and they really wouldn't mean it. I found so many things challenging despite speaking Spanish. So, it is interesting. And I came back more British than I ever expected. And the whole idea of the program was to make people feel integrated into Europe, and not saying that it would make me anti-Europe. It didn't make me anti-Europe at all, but I really didn't feel that that program had met its aims in that respect.
That's really interesting that, I think that, so cross-cultural psychology, so you've got cultural psychology that really looks at cultures specifically. It's almost like anthropology, Cross-cultural psychology really is looking more at across cultures, to look at what is universal and what is culture specific. And I think that those little examples that you give about queuing, about people inviting you to your home and not meaning it, I find that absolutely fascinating. And I started the cross-cultural PhD. It was, there's a bit of a story behind it, but I was so interested in that difference between what is universal and what is cultural subjective. And the psychology aspect is that, in psychology, you've got many different disciplines. So you've got developmental is focused on children, clinical is focused on therapy work, and neuro and cognitive psychology researchers are interested in the brain. The social psychology is then the assessment of how humans behave in groups. But within that field, there are some scholars that are more on the evolutionary end. So, for example, Jim Sedanius from Harvard, who recently passed away, he argues that people will always engage in social dominance behavior. Whereas others believe in human agency. People are, they can make their own decisions. It's not predetermined, such as Steve Reicher, who, for instance, is currently advising the UK government on COVID-19 policies. And so cross-cultural psychology is then interested in all aspects of psychology, but adds to it the goal to ascertain what is universal and what is culture specific, without then saying one way is better than another. And that is key. So John Berry, one of the founders of cross-cultural psychology, he says it so well. He says what is taught is often the psychology of a very small sample of people, mainly Western, Euro-American students, sometimes adults, and it only covers 12% of the world's population. So this idea that we have a science of human behavior based on that sample simply cannot be sustained. And cross-cultural psychology tries to include many other cultures, combine them, compare similarities and differences, and then find out what makes us human. And John Barry, for instance, has done a lot of important research about immigrants. So you and I have traveled, we've lived in different countries, and he actually says that if you go somewhere, it's really good to go for the integration option. So not complete assimilation, where you just, completely forget your own background, not segregation, where it would be kind of like me living in the UK and just eating Dutch food and wearing clogs and refusing to, be integrate in society. But basically to kind of balance both. And Sirab Kelles, who was my PhD student, who's now esteemed colleague and friend, she, for instance, looked at unaccompanied kids from Afghanistan who would come to Norway on their own. And that it turned out that they adapted better to life in Norway with the support to help them integrate. So to keep their Afghani background and balance that with their new way of life in Norway. Yeah.
And I don't think there's easy answers with this. I think this is the thing, isn't it? It's that mixture of identity, social norms, stigma, bias. It all comes together in this topic, I think. And then just the term culture then, Nathalie, like what does the term culture mean to you? This is an exercise I do in my training courses on cultural awareness, but what does the term culture mean to you?
Okay. Well, to us in cross-cultural psychology, and I guess to me, culture is a system of shared meaning. So any group has a culture, a sports club, a religious community, and we learn about specific values and norms of how things are done. Some cultures are passported or formal, and others aren't. We have symbols, we have a logo, we have a song. It can be helpful to understand about cultural differences and how these differences are translated into behaviors within a community. I think, and the key thing is that as a researcher or a decision maker, you aim to remain objective. So what is normal for the spider is chaos for the fly. And I think that, if you look at macro or international level, a lot of work has been done to map the world, not just in terms of, for instance, economic indices such as GDP, but also cultural values. And it can be helpful to know that in Taiwan, people are more collectivistic than in Germany, because it can explain, for example, a community's response to lockdown rules, simply because a consideration for the group is more familiar and accepted there. But then when we've done our data collection on a massive scale, and we found that overall in Germany, they're more individualistic than Taiwan, we don't add a desirability label to it, because a label of preference would be culturally subjective anyway. And people like Michelle Galfand mapped the world in terms of, for instance, tightness and looseness. So Singapore is a tight country, the Netherlands is more loose. And she argues, that the point is to find a balance between rules and freedom. Things shift. For instance, because of digitization, border control is now more tight here in the UK, and the responsibility of the individuals when you go on, once you get to go on a plane, for example, you type in your passport number before you travel. British universities must collect data from foreign guest lectures and hand it over to the state. So things shift constantly, and that's why research and continuing conversations about what culture is and what the norms and the values are is really important.
And I think it's so helpful that you said anything can have a culture. So sports teams, absolutely. Logos, symbols, organizational charts, but also who actually holds the power. It could be someone who's been in an organization for 20 years. It could be someone who brings in grant money. It could be someone who has lots of external sway and is great at promoting an organization. So I think also for me, culture is thinking about the different power sources and power dynamics within an organization. I think people can also forget about that, and absolutely culture shifts. It doesn't stay stagnant. There might be some core parts that are always present. So for me, I think about the UK, if we think about, and I think I spoke to you about this before, didn't I, Nathalie? But Guy Fawkes Night and the history of that is pretty horrendous. Like it's one of my favorite nights of the year, bonfire night. But then when I think about it and the history behind it and the tyranny, I think, wow, we're still celebrating this, 600 years after it happened, give or take. So that culture stays, but it also shifts around the cornerstones.
Yes. And I think so. what you just said about Guy Fawkes, now we've got an equivalent in Holland, Sinterklaas, which is our Dutch Santa. And he has a helper, Black Pete, and it's horrendous. It's absolutely horrendous. And the thing is, if I know people close to my, if you like, family, friend circle who do not want that tradition to be touched. And it blows my mind. But, it's difficult. And we have to be careful with the, imposing our norms and our values onto others, because that's why dialogue and continuous work with one another is so important, because people need to kind of be motivated, learning and understanding from within, really. Just saying to someone, you can't do this anymore, is really tricky. And I think enculturation is learning from each other. It's not genetic. We learn from younger generations as much as they learn from older people. And the difference between the younger and the older generation is that the latter may see the human as a diamond with various facets, but the former, the younger generation, sees it as a liquid, constantly changing. So here we've got culture difference between age groups. And I learn from my students as much as I hope they learn from me. And we've got some really difficult challenges ahead in terms of climate crisis, but also identity politics. And we need all the heads and all the cultural knowledge to work together to provide solutions. And I think that just to kind of go back onto what you just said about this cultural tradition and my example too, is like, so someone like Amina Abu Bakr, she is a cross-cultural researcher who focuses on the development of children and is interested in the tools that are developed by mainly Western experts and if they're useful in a different cultural context. So, for instance, you might have a tool that tests whether children are, developing properly or whether they are autistic, so neurological disorders. And then you say, okay, we have this tool, but it was developed in the UK, Oxford University, for example. That's where she also worked. Now you can decide, okay, do we adopt, do we adapt, or do we create a new tool? And so we need to be mindful of what is called imposed ethic, where people assume that the findings from a study in one culture can be applied universally. And this imposition of a norm happens a lot in research, but also in coaching, working together generally. And we assume that a tool or a way of working is universal. So, for example, someone with a vision who motivates, who is a good communicator, is universally perceived as a good leader. But what constitutes a good communicator varies across cultures. In some contexts, being direct and expressive is good, but in others, you are seen as more trustworthy when you're indirect and diplomatic. And so this is why I came up with the phrase, there is no such thing as Greenwich Mean Time communication. There is no neutral norm, like time, from which other communities deviate. And when you accept that, it will actually be a relief. Because then that position of privilege or power that also comes with responsibilities and this really curious notion that you have to stretch out your hand in order for others to, to benefit from your position on that platform, you need to be tolerant of their differences. That ceases to exist. And that's really, I think, one way forward in our this complexity of this globalized world.
Yeah, I think dialogue's always the key, isn't it? But building on what you've just said then, why do you think workplaces struggle to identify their culture? So going back to the conversation we had around, every entity or group has some kind of culture. And also, this idea there's no such thing as neutral, but why do dominant cultures prevalent in many UK workplaces, they really struggle to identify their culture too? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so organizational culture is different from national culture. And this view on importance keeps shifting, by the way. So for instance, now there's more emphasis is put on organizational values, and a client or somebody who's looking for a job may take this in consideration for collaborative decisions. It wasn't so important that, for instance, an organization was ethical or that they had sustainable values, but that is becoming increasingly important. So that's part of their organizational culture. And organizational culture is perhaps more bounded. So an executive team can set a mission and ask people to be either loose or tight. And being strict about use of personal phones might be an efficiency thing, or it might be a security issue. So, for example, for a fintech company that deals with people's money and security details. So people who work for organizations, they're not robots. They are social beings. And one of their identities is their nationality, which is my area of expertise. So I'll focus on that for a bit. So currently I work for a very diverse and international university, Middlesex University. It has about 167 nationalities represented among students and staff. Now, the university, like any other higher education institution, has a student union with many societies that reflect the celebration of a specific cultural group. You've got the Portuguese society, you've got the Arab society, the Polish society. And what is complex is this balance. You celebrate a cultural group, a national group even, and yet we are also being asked to be culture blind and to treat everyone equally. And that makes some people nervous. This is reverse discrimination, say some people. But what they forget is that they don't need a group because they are already a member of what is the assumed norm. The issue here is the indicator. What people forget is that there is an assumed norm and all else deviates from this. So a class on leadership is based on a Western perspective of what leadership is. And then you might, as a student, get the optional module, Japanese leadership. And of course, you could agree with other researchers such as Edward Said, who is the Palestinian-American professor of literature who wrote Orientalism, that to allocate values to a people is the end of humanity. And values are often used as a currency to measure culture. So the issue is this a form of sophisticated stereotyping? Whether at national or organizational level, you ask people to indicate their preferences for one value over another. You calculate a mean and average score, and then you compare one to another. And some people find that tricky, and I get that, I understand that. Especially if you then, for instance, get these initiatives like, for instance, in the UK, we had the One Britain, One Nation, launched with values such as tolerance, kindness, pride. But pride in what? Tolerance in terms of what? So I understand that argument about organizational culture or national culture. On the other hand, when people tell me that my work is problematic, they are often from a privileged, educated position where they rarely are in conflict with people from another background, because perhaps they keep the company of people from all over the world of the same socioeconomic educated background. Now, if you tell my shipping and logistic MBA students, who are a captain or an engineer on a ship that carries Amazon items from China for weeks on end and have to work and live with an international crew, that nationality doesn't matter, they will tell you a different story. And in a webinar on culture with the Dutch embassy, Ron Fisher talks about the challenges of cross-cultural research because people find it objectionable that we survey people on their values to compare nationalities. But in order to advance knowledge, we have to start somewhere. When you come to the doctor with a problem, you will ask questions, you'll do more tests. And I also think that this issue about nationalities and culture is generational. So Klaus Dodds explains that in 1987, Reagan was asking Gorbachev to open the doors. Now, borders disputes are increasing, not only in the West, but also in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. National identities are more important now. And this happened for a variety of reasons, like COVID, obviously. And so governments promise citizens security by making border controls stronger, or they try to extend their borders. And so for one generation, open borders meant freedom. We were all supposed to see everybody as a global citizen. And for others, more recently, it's now seen as a threat and a lack of control. So combining all that and taking all that research into consideration, we're not just simply one nationality or another. We are maybe young, queer Dutch researcher or middle-aged Black British lecturer. This is, intersectionality. And you and I have talked about this a lot. And in the Netherlands, men are more likely to be funded and promoted. But in the UK, that issue is about the wide perceived British scholars versus the global South majority. And I think these differences, these nuances are really important, so that, intersectionality issues are not all the same from one country to another. So we need to be very careful if there's something going on in, let's say, the USA related to culture and race and some of the challenges that they face. It doesn't necessarily mean that also applies to the UK. So we need to do more research and find out what are the values that drive the differences, the discrepancies, to find out more about how we perceive one another. And once we know that, we can then try and find a solution. And you can learn through allyship. And I know that term is a little bit under debate. WRE talks about coalitions. And I guess what we need to do in terms of cultural, so organizational culture and national culture, I think we need to create new spaces, not ones where you include someone else into it without actually changing that space. If you have diverse teams, you actually really gain in terms of creativity, but you might also suffer a loss because there might be more conflict. And this is a little bit controversial, but it also seems that the right to express our social identities within the organization or within the national context has been claimed by certain ideological groups. Now, this definitely warrants more research, but it seems that national identity is claimed by the right, whereas gender, sexuality, and ethnic identity seems to be claimed by the left. And I think regardless of what identity is, maybe by buddying up or having an ally, but it has to be a relationship of equal partners. You can really learn from one another. And I've recently buddied up with my colleague, Michael Cordoso. He is a leadership scholar who is Black, Nigerian, British, father of two. He is the one who told me that in Nigeria, they say, common is not common. How things are done in one place is not how things are done in another. So these conversations need to keep happening.
And the norm, like why are these things happening for these quote unquote special groups in the workplace? And I think you're right there as well around, if you tell someone to just stop doing something, it makes them angry. And I think this is the backlash we've seen. It's the Obama lash, I call it. It's what we've seen, I think, as a result. I feel like it's still ongoing in this country from a Labour leadership and how things were done, and everyone feels emboldened, not everyone, but people feel emboldened to come out. And this whole left-wing, right-wing polarization, I find it really difficult because I think I almost prefer to think of it as leaning to a more collectivist, thinking of the good benefit of everyone, and thinking of a more individualized way of, I'm really scared of the power being taken away from me. That's a more helpful way for me to think about it, but that's not easy, catchy, and it doesn't make good headlines.
Yeah, and it's gosh, I all of what you're saying I think it's so layered. And when you say things like, the who has the power, I feel that we're facing a future where some of the challenges are so complex, and we need to look at it from so many angles, taking into consideration nationality, but also, ethnicity, age differences, but all of that is about coming together and being willing to listen to one another, because I think that we are facing some challenges that requires that collective intelligence, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and your point about diversity as well. It's not, this approach of, oh, right, we just need to hire some more people that are X, Y, Z, and it will be more diverse. And it's like, well, no, you've got to do more than that. And you've got to think about your readiness and your appetite and what does diversity really mean? Because everyone will be bringing some kind of diversity to the table. Like you've said, if it's age, if it's caring responsibilities, if it's career diversity, but what is exactly that you're trying to say? So I think thinking about the differences in my eyes between Dutch culture and British culture, it's that much more direct, right? In Dutch culture, and the way that British people will pad around the words and feel, it's actually, it's shameful to be direct, or, it's very rare here that people will get up in your face and shout. I think it's becoming less rare, but particularly in the workplace, that would be a huge faux pas. To speak directly is also seen as brusque, as weird, as, you lose a lot of face in this country, but yet people are very cutting in a passive aggressive way. And that's something I still really struggle with.
Yeah. And like, again, just sitting with Michael as a colleague, and we were talking about, for instance, the race relations in the US, is that different than in the UK? And it was such a wonderful conversation because I thought that it was. And he said, Natalie, I think it's not. He said, it's just that it's different. And in America, they're more direct and open about it. It's definitely. Whereas in the UK, they're just not, they're denying it. They're saying it's not happening. And they may even wrote an official report to say that.
To deny it,
So it's about the communication, which is the medium, how things are communicated. But what is happening underneath might actually be equally problematic. And that requires a lot of coming together, sitting together, listening to one another. I think that's really, really important.
And so what do you think workplaces can do to introduce conversations about culture more effectively as part of the day-to-day and making this business as usual?
Start with doubt. This is what, for example, someone like Rob Reiner, who really promotes the importance of evidence-based management, he says that, and I totally support that. Any organization that is interested in investigating how they work should start with doubt and ask questions. Identify the problem, really spend time on this. Don't jump to the solutions. That's making assumptions about the issues. Organizational, governmental leaders should really use research, data, combine this with other sources of information. Like I said, the allyship, sit together and really start to say, okay, in our organization, what are the issues? Just because the media is shouting about one issue, find out if that is really something that matters in your organization, in your context. And also, again, going back to that, standing on a platform and extending your hand to people beneath you. I'm phrasing it, in a direct way, I suppose. But I had an MBA student, a British white MBA student, who asked me, Natalie, what do I do in a team of people from diverse backgrounds? And I said, why do you feel the need to do anything? You're not superior or the norm. Just be curious and ask questions. But it has to come from a point of genuine interest. Don't assume you're the one who needs to be tolerant and knowing of all others' faiths, values, ethnicities. It is exhausting. It is as people are so layered now in terms of their identity, it's also very difficult. There you go, reading up about, how the Japanese greet each other versus how the Chinese greet each other. And then you're wrong, because that Japanese person happened to have studied at Harvard or happened to have done work for years in Brazil. So be open to learn and be part of the discussion. Are there terms that you don't understand? Ask. Does it change from, BAME to something else? Okay, adapt. And also understand that some people, for instance, from the gay community, don't actually want a strong campaign within their workplace. I spoke to someone who said, I identify with my vocation, but I'm married to a man, but I don't want to be part of that explicit gay pride community. And all these voices need to be heard. And these voices may change over time. Culture's not set in stone. It will change. So be prepared that somewhere else they already invented the wheel and they do things better, and be curious about that. And, the issue is not always actually the change. It can also be the speed with which things are happening. So be open and mindful of the different perspectives. And if you truly believe in the value of diversity, are you then willing to help the white 50-year-old man? I don't know that I realize this is a bit controversial, but, white privilege means that one's race has never been a disadvantage to whatever life throws at you. So yes, you can still be white and unemployed or poor or in danger, but it's unlikely due to your skin color. Now, this is complex because in some areas of London, and this is then now about a difference between urban versus rural or industrial geographical divide. So kids from the global South majority in London may fare better because of the support that is available than, for instance, kids from a mining community in a post-industrial town like Barnsley. So it's layered, and we need to work together. There's no one CEO or politician that can tackle this. We need to work together, and that's why we need people like you, for example.
Yeah, that's really kind. And I actually don't try and steer away from the term white privilege, not because I don't like it, but because it really riles people. So I talk about systemic advantage, and I show a wheel of different facets of identity and say we all have a power and privilege signature or a systemic advantage signature, and that some people's is really faint, like on tracing paper, and some people's is very, very clear, as if it's been written with dark marker pen. So see your identity. What is your identity when you look at this, and where do you think you might have been advantaged and disadvantaged? And then people can engage with it, because they could say, oh, actually body size, I used to be large, then I lost a lot of weight, and it gave me certain advantages I wasn't aware of. Or I became a biological parent. I was pregnant. I felt part of this really great club, and I got treated in a particular way versus when I wasn't going to have children. So yeah, I do think that it's layered, but I also think in order to understand systemic disadvantage, people have to engage with their own advantages and disadvantages and see that it's not someone's fault and not blame someone.
Yeah, and that's responsibility, and being able to look at yourself rather than always seeing everything else as different, but just look at yourself and say, okay, where do I sit, and what are my norms and values, and then what does that mean in terms of my contribution, actually can help you, make you feel not so much that it's a good thing, like we're all a little bit of a part of a puzzle, and together we can then all contribute. And so, for those of us among us who work in management teams, and for instance, you want innovation, you want creativity, and you say, let's think differently. Ask yourself, differently from what? What is your assumed 0 degrees? We can't campaign for inclusion if we're not willing to change the space. I mean it, especially as a woman. Inclusion to what? Whose platform am I invited to, and what if I don't want to get on it? Right? So once you have the baseline of no norm has been established, then you can consider communication styles. We need a recognition that we all have a capacity to learn and to grow. We need to stay curious and stay away from judgment. If you're confused or something triggers you, ask, tell me more. What makes you say that? And in an organization, you need to define what success looks like for everyone, right? And be prepared that this is complex. And I just listened to Emmanuel Acho, who does a podcast on uncomfortable questions with a Black man. And he says he's Black by skin color, Nigerian by culture, white by education. And success means different things in these different contexts. Now, and then I just, this might sound counter to a little bit of what I've just said, and also I've talked about power and leadership and maybe rules, but we did do a big study, and across 17 countries with loads of people, loads of organizations, and we did find that if the world out there is really uncertain, then actually formalization helps people to collaborate and voice ideas together. So if you're an organization and you are working in an environment that is uncertain, and let's face it, that's happening to most countries right now, then actually saying, these are the things, this is what is accepted and familiar here, this is how we want to work together, can actually make people feel that they're under kind of organizational wings. It kind of makes them feel like, okay, I understand where I stand. And that can help also.
Yeah, I always talk about team charters. I say they might sound really babyish, but if everyone can put into it and feel they have some agency and feel that they've contributed to a way that you're going to work together with each other, with clients, with customers, with internal stakeholders, it can really, really help. So those points about communication, who makes tea, when we have breaks, you can take it as detailed as you want. And actually it does make a huge difference.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you say babyish, but there's this idea of like there is it helps to have some kind of regularity for people in terms of their mental health, just to calm things down a little bit.
Mm. And so, Nathalie, this work is full on. It's, it's incredibly, intellectually draining at times. It's frustrating. So as a busy person and a cross-cultural psychologist, how do you look after your own mental health, and what are your top 3 tips?
Gosh, that's a really good question. I thought about it a lot. I really care about mental health because I see an increase in students who really struggle. It's gone exponential, actually, among young people. And now adolescents, actually, gosh, there might be some differing opinions here, but research has kind of indicated that it's from about the age of 14 to 24. So, that's a long period of adolescence, and there's a lot of insecurity. And I talk to students, and all these words that are being used, like mental health, anxiety, and things like that. And they are, they try to balance multiple social identities, and this is really difficult. And I don't think it's isolated to young people. I think also everyone, mental health issues are I recently spoke to a GP, and she said that the number of people that come through her door with mental health issues is huge. And I think that I would add to this, so there's you can try to figure out what is personal and what is cultural. And just to give you a little example, because I just know that this is just maybe an interesting example to illustrate this. So in this webinar that we held for Dutch people now in Britain after Brexit, they never really thought about being Dutch. And suddenly after Brexit, being maybe a little bit less welcome, their national identity got amplified, and they started to think about that. And I know that in the big scheme of things, it's not such a big deal, but it matters for the individual, because one person asked, I am now too direct for the British, but I'm too indirect for the Dutch. Where do I go? This sense of belonging is so important. So find where you are celebrated for your mental health, not where you are tolerated. And I don't like the word tolerance.
No, neither do I.
It's indicative of a power imbalance. I tolerate you. So yeah, find people who wish you well. And of course, then that begs the question, are we then creating our own echo chambers? Yeah, okay. But it doesn't have to be an ideological group. It can be gardening, arts, and football. So Michael and I, we connected about football. And of course, we believe in education and human development. So we had a lot to talk about. And for me personally, the daily practice of self-care, that takes up time. And it's a little bit like lovingly weeding a garden. I need to maybe stop wanting to fix things and simply engage in the practice of recognizing what I feel, pause, reflect, practice self-compassion. Yeah.
Thank you. And it's easier said than done, isn't it, Nathalie? I think we all know we should do it, but it's easier said than done. And yeah, I do agree with the point around tolerance. Tolerance to me is a big T pushing someone away. That's how I see the word tolerance. That's the image it conjures up in my mind. But yeah, so I think that's a really lovely tip about celebrate, where you belong, celebrate where you are, where you feel that sense of belonging. Yeah. So thank you so much for your time and all your insights. And if people want to know more about your work, and I'll of course include this in the show notes, how should they contact you, get in touch with you, find out more?
Yeah, so I really welcome constructive interactions, and you can find more information via the website identityresearch.org. My podcast Polaris is in the making, so hopefully by the time that this comes out, we'll have that running. And this is all about navigating this complex globalized world. So much more about what we've talked about today. You can find me via the university website or Twitter at Dr Van Meurs, or LinkedIn by my name. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
It's been brilliant. And thank you. So don't forget, we're kicking off this month, everyone, talking about culture. There's going to be lots of exciting podcasts, more about culture in the workplace. I'm going to be reviewing the book, The Culture Map by Erin Meyer. So we'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.